are going to start this technical session with the team of ValuCred, which is Yunus Environment Hub, will outline, identify gaps and opportunities in PC market, plus a brief introduction of ValuCred. And our presenters are Christina Jäger from Yunus Environment Hub and Claudia Bokenborg from Rodiek and Nelson. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much and welcome from my side. I'm Christina from Yunus Environment Hub. And who's navigating the slides? Shall I just mention on next because I can't navigate them myself?
Yeah, it's me, Christina, Maria.
Perfect. Okay, then I just say next time. Okay, cool. Yeah, you can, thank you. You can go to the next slide already. So yeah, I have the pleasure to present to you ValuCred, which is a consortium consisting of Yunus Environment Hub, Nelson Rodiek, and Black Forest Solutions. And what we did is, on the one hand side, an analysis of stakeholders, roles and dynamics of plastic credit schemes and markets on the one hand side, and then the development and the testing of a standardized process model for streamlining the plastic credit market. Go next. And what is ValuCred's vision? What we want to bring is transparency, coordination, and convergence in plastic credit financing schemes. And we actually do not see this only relevant for plastic credit schemes, but basically for financing schemes in countries in transition towards an EPR system, where we also see plastic credits having the potential, if implemented well, being a bridging mechanism until EPR policies are in place. So what we want to do is, on the one hand side, integrate the principles of independence and impartiality to plastic credit standard stakeholder roles. We want to align plastic credit schemes and regulating standards with EPR principles. Very importantly, stop comparing plastic credits to carbon credits because they are fundamentally different, and we're going to get to that in a second. Then we want that the pricing of plastic credits should follow social and environmental criteria and also should be based on the needs of local waste management stakeholders, not the needs or the wishes of plastic credit buyers. And finally, what we see as necessary that the stakeholders involved in plastic credit markets to adopt a common language. Next slide, please. So what are the challenges of the current plastic credits market, which is a relatively new market? It has been a very dynamic market. So within the last close to 2 years where I've been working on this project, so many new actors just within these 2 years have arisen. And one thing that we saw that often, in many cases, plastic credits were compared to carbon credits and its schemes were copied and mimicked, which created a lot of challenges and issues because their impacts are different. CO2 emitted in one place affect the entire global climate, whereas plastic waste has an effect on a local context, and also the collection and the recycling of plastic waste. These costs are so different from one place to the other. As well, unlike in carbon trading with regulatory emission reduction targets, there are weak incentives for polluters to reduce plastic pollution. And finally, there is no regulatory framework and globally agreed definition of plastic credits, unlike in the carbon credit market, where we know that 1 carbon credit equals 1 joule of CO2 equivalents. Maybe this will change with the Global Plastic Treaty, but at the moment, there is no such framework. Next, please. And in the plastic credits market, there are basically 3 main stakeholder categories that form this market. It's on the one hand side, voluntary standard setters. Secondly, verifiers and certifiers. And thirdly, actors who either develop and or implement plastic credit projects and or trade these plastic credits. And in the current market, often these roles are either overlapping or they're not completely transparent to the outsider of who is taking which role or having which responsibility. Next slide, please. So on the one hand side, plastic credits have an opportunity for being a new financial instrument that is so needed for the waste sector that is so much underfinanced, and having the potential of being a performance-based payment market tool that could drive socioeconomic development in the waste sector if certain criteria are being taken into account. But then it is not clear what a plastic credit really represents. Is a plastic credit 1 ton, 1 kg, 1 pound of plastic? Which plastic? Does it account all of them or only certain types? Are they treated equally? And what the comparable measures of environmental impacts could be. So in the report, next slide, please. In the report that we published last year, we basically listed there all of the key findings, as well our recommendations on what we see would be needed in order to make this market more transparent and create coordination. And just to repeat, because I think it's really crucial, the key findings were that plastic credits are wrongfully compared to carbon credits, which ignore important particularities of the plastic waste crisis. The roles and responsibilities of stakeholders involved in plastic credit market are often overlapping or intransparent. There is the lack of a regulatory framework and common terminology amongst the market players. And plastic credits are wrongfully treated as commodity trade, disregarding the environmental services of waste workers. Next slide, please. And one thing, when we then started with the development of this standard process model, was that we as the ValuCred team said that we don't want to reinvent the wheel, but base it and use existing references from frameworks such as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the Global Living Wage Coalition, ISO, ESG, and GRI standards, and to really use this interconnected system thinking. And I'm gonna hand over now to Fatime, who's gonna tell you more about the standard process model that we developed, and then I come back to you to share some more insights on how we went about with the testing of the same. Over to you, Fatime.
Yeah, thank you, Christina. Silke, did you want to say something?
I just want to mention that please mute your microphones if you are not speaking. And there will be question and answers at the end of the session starting at 4:30. So please mute your mics.
Okay, yeah, I think some of you maybe saw me yesterday already with the ValuCred pitch. I had to jump in today for Claudia Bunkenborg, and I'm happy to be here. So yeah, let me talk about a little bit more about the standard process model that we developed in the last 1.5 years almost. As Christina already said a little bit, we are currently in a plastic credit market that is very highly unregulated. And to move this forward to more regulated EPR systems, we developed this kind of standard process model. We have to look on the one hand to informal or semi-formal waste collectors and recyclers, which often don't have the tools to bring such a deep and formal level of information that formal brands and sponsoring companies may require to give appropriate funding. So the real motivation at the moment for these brands is definitely sustainability. And in the standard process model, we therefore wanted to incorporate this aspect of sustainability and ESG reporting to bring together these two kind of very different worlds. And therefore, we implemented 15 out of 17 SDGs in the ValuCred SPM, and also used ISO 14001 criteria and also the high-level structure of ISO standards to make the standard process model very easy to incorporate into existing business processes and also existing management systems from brands. And to have a common and globally recognized reporting structure where we can then fill it with the data that is captured during the operations in the value chain, we used the GRI standards, and there we have 12 out of 23 GRI standards that are incorporated in the standard process model. Next slide, please. Okay, so as I said, we looked very much to operating EPR systems, and there you can basically identify four levels, which is management, financial flow, operation, and reporting. And then we looked at the current plastic credit market and identified and also added some of the processes that are needed in this respective process levels. So this here is just an example of process elements that we have matched or incorporated in the respective process element. For management, it can be, for example, that companies need to identify and make real waste reduction goals. So they have to commit to a strategy. But who wants to know more about the levels of the process model and also about all of the process elements? You can read about that in a handbook that we will release in the next 1 or 2 weeks, and you will get access over Prevent to it. Next slide, please. So when I talk about process elements, that's basically how you can imagine it. It is a flow of logical steps that need to be done either by service provider or either by brands. So this is the broad overview of all the process elements that we have identified and defined. And it is split into 4 process levels. And yeah, it can be used by service providers for an orientation. And as I said, brands can also implement that into their existing management systems. And in the handbook, there's also more information of how that can be done. Next slide, please. So the most important fact and advantage of the standard process model is also that it is not only globally applicable, but the data can really be measured in a local context. So we wanted to make sure that waste tracking and data collection on the environmental impact plays a huge role, as well as the social impact, including different kinds of measures of the SDGs. And then, as we want to bring more financing into services that are already doing waste collection, plastic collection and recycling, we also have a huge emphasizes on the remuneration of workers, because with ValuCred we want to make sure that these services get paid in such a level that it ensures the livelihood of these workers. Next slide. Besides the tracking of environmental and social impact, we have developed a digital interface of ValuCred for the data collection during the testing phase. Christina will talk about the testing phase in a little bit. But for some of the process elements, for example, the collection of operational data, we used the digital solution provider CleanHub. And this slide here, we want to show it to you and especially to solution providers, because we think that the SPM is also a great chance to map your own solution in the respective process element. Because one advantage, of course, would be that you would not only get more visibility in the plastic credit market, but also if brands incorporate their the SPM into their existing management systems, your digital solution could also potentially be be used by these brands to help them collect, for example, operational data or social data. So with the SPM, we really want to offer to all stakeholders who are interested and have digital solutions that they develop to map themselves. And we are glad to help out and lead through this whole process chain. Next slide. So in summary, what does ValuCred SPM offer? It is a useful orientation map for various stakeholders working in an international cross-sectoral environment between EPR and plastic credit markets. And as you have seen, it can be used as a landscape to map your different digital solutions. And therefore, we can also all agree and develop a common understanding of core elements of the value chain and also talk about terms and definitions and agree on minimum data dimensions and data points, which is a crucial aspect, what we also found out during the testing phase, but we will talk about that later. And if different digital solution providers map themselves into the SPM, then you can also see where maybe some other digital solution providers work in the same field, and you can have the exchange between your companies and therefore support the interoperability between digital solutions. And yeah, all of what I just said and also mostly of what Christina said earlier is summarized in our handbook. And as I said, it will be released in the next 1 or 2 weeks via Prevent. So that's all from my side. I'm happy to get the questions later in the afternoon, and I hand back to Christina.
Thanks, Fatime. And yeah, so after developing the standard process model, as I said, we tested this with the downstream part of the service providers. So we were looking starting from waste collectors level to scrap shop level, aggregators level. And in the beginning, we needed to identify those participants for the testing, which was challenging, I have to say. Like the topics EPR, plastic credits, SDG standards, these are all concepts that are not known to these stakeholders. So we needed to find a language to make them understand what ValuCred was about, what was in for them, what their benefits would be, which is particularly challenging if this is something that is a future benefit that they would get. So we really carefully selected the participants of the testing phase, which we implemented in India and in Vietnam, in 2 countries. And once we selected them, we had some introductory training sessions and also capacity building sessions, where on the one hand side, we explained to them on what would go and happen during the testing phase, what are the different process steps that they would have to perform, and any questions that they had. And then we also provided some digital literacy skill training, because data entries would happen over an app and over a digital interface. And many of these, although they might have smartphones, weren't really used with operating with apps or entering data through these apps. So this was one part. And it took us a couple of weeks to onboard them. And after that, we basically started with the testing part, in the sense that whenever the first stakeholder group, so informal waste collector, would come to the scrap shop, the data was being tracked in terms of the materials, the quantities, the types that have been delivered, as well as the socioeconomic data and questions that we had put up in ValuCred. And through these data were then being fed into the management system, from which we made an analysis and report that we then showed to the scrap shop owners and the operators of the aggregators, which was quite interesting to them, because for many of them, none of the operations is digitalized. So they had never seen a report or being able to get such an analysis of which supplier is bringing the most material, or seeing the distribution in such a structured way of the different types of materials, etc., etc. And then we also conducted feedback rounds in various stages of the testing phase. That was a total of about 6 months. To the next slide, you will see some pictures. This here's one from India, where you can see the different groups being gathered in the very beginning, and when they basically decided and joined their participation. And on the next slide, you will see also how we operationalize the data entry, that waste pickers would receive a QR code that would then be scanned whenever they came with their collection material, and the same then also from scrap shop level to the next aggregation point. And as I said, it was in the beginning quite challenging to identify participants who wanted to join the program due to various reasons, and we have listed them in the lessons learned section that we will come next. But what's very interesting was that throughout the course of this testing phase, many, let's say, neighboring scrap shop or aggregator businesses, when they heard about ValuCred and about what was happening with the participating stakeholders, they became interested and they approached us. So in the beginning, us going out there trying to find participating partners. Throughout the piloting, then many other stakeholders came in and approached us, asking about whether there was also opportunities for them to get involved, or when a new project was starting. So this was also quite interesting to see. And before I go too much into the lessons learned, I would now, I think, hand back to Fatime, because we have divided the lessons learned according to the thematic topics, and I think she will present the first 2, and then I will share further on the testing part. Back to you, Fatime.
Thank you. Yes. Okay, so the first lesson learned is the the applicability to local context has to be improved in some of the process elements. So for example, the types and names of collected material is very different from region to region. And when we received the first data on operational, on the operations, we of course had different kinds of names for example, hard plastics were not divided sometimes into or HDPE. It was sometimes called rigid plastic or other names. So we wanted, and we also have defined that in the ValuCred SPM, that we want to use the global definition and use the global names, the numbers 1 to 7 for plastics. But yeah, there needs to be a solution that is more applicable for some of the local context. And then another lesson that we learned was that that also goes along with terms and definitions, that yeah, the scrap shops that I call scrap shop in Vietnam are maybe not the same what people in India or in Angola, where we had testing, would call them. So we need to have clear definitions about these terms, because yeah, you can call it aggregator, scrap shop, or delivery point, all kinds of things, and that's where we also want to have the conversations with all stakeholders, and also especially with yeah, with just a broader audience or stakeholders that also operate in different countries. Then we can go to the next slide. Okay, and yeah, the second lesson learned is about the interoperability between digital solutions, because they also require standardization. We need to agree on minimum standards for data elements and also data dimensions and data points, because yeah, when we want that different digital solutions exchange data or can also send data to yeah, a newly established PRO or something like that, then we need to have like a common understanding of what kind of data we want to collect, and also in what kind of format. So we had, for example, also issues with the date format. Sometimes it was in this format that you can see here at the moment, XXXX, MM, and DD. But that's also very different from region to region. And yeah, we didn't really have the scope of developing like a full like digital solution that can do all of that automatically. So there was a lot of manual work to then streamline the data into one standardized format. So yeah, these things that you can see here are like the minimum requirements that we identified for ValuCred SPM that we want to agree on. Name of collector, date, geographical location, the payment period, material type, weight of material. I mean, that's also very crucial if we get the data in kilogram or in tons, or yeah, other kinds of inventions sometimes. And then yeah, the purchase price and documentation of payment. Yeah, we just need to develop like a standardized format, and also that would bring us to yeah, more a better exchange of data between different digital solutions. And yeah, I think, Christina, now it's your turn from slide 3.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. Thanks, Fatima.
Thanks.
Yeah, so more lessons learned. As I mentioned in the beginning, it wasn't easy to convince stakeholders to participate in the testing due to mistrust issues, fear due informal business practices that of course many of these have, that they weren't sure, like, were we spying on them for the government, were we, an anxiety about, how the local government would learn about these, and also anxiety to share operational business data. And many of especially on the waste collectors level, right? Many of these, they might not possess an ID, or might not be registered, might be homeless people or refugees. So this data acquisition and the onboarding of the stakeholders was a challenge, but that I said we kind of overcame by looking very closely at who would be suitable candidates for such a pilot, meaning that these were stakeholders operating for a really long time in the market, and were scrap shops, also were registered businesses, and were like such issues never arose. And then through their participation, gaining further trust inside the community and the neighboring scrap shops or aggregators that heard about the pilot, which I thought was quite positive. Then the next lesson learned, thank you, is that the integration of informal collectors and also the small business owners require specific training. One thing that I already mentioned was the training in digital literacy that is required in most of the local context. As said, like some, they were just using their phone, even if it's a smartphone, for answering calls. And again, being very hesitant in the beginning, saying like, oh, we don't know if we can fulfill what you want us to do. But then surprisingly, also they were surprised that they learned much faster than they thought that they would. In the end, also what we were asking from them was no rocket science. So I think this was also both key lessons learned on both sides, and where the stakeholders reported to us also in the feedbacks afterwards that they are not afraid of learning new things if these are things that where they see that it can benefit themselves and their livelihoods. But then also lessons that we got on the project side was that the trainings were time consuming and very difficult to implement remotely. So this really requires on-site presence. And we also had one project staff member in the first 3 weeks after the trainings to be with them at like scrap shop or aggregated level every day, like throughout the entire day, to be there to come in if there was an issue or an question. And then later on, this was then on we're just checking in sporadically, but really having this close assistant in the beginning was very important. I think also for the participants to not lose their motivation, because this is also one thing that if one thing doesn't work, if there's a technical issue or they don't know how to operate it, that this would discourage them and they would not look further into it. And then also training materials that they need to be in local language. I guess this is common sense, that this is just really helpful for them to better understand. And that the onboarding time of the pilot project partners varied quite a lot, let's say between 4 to 12 weeks that it took us to have them ready and to be able to generate constant operational data for us to analyze. And then the last lesson is, probably not a surprise that, of course, the financial benefit is the main driver for the service provider to participate in such a scheme. And but it was not only the increased income, but also non-financial distributions were appreciated, such as essential goods or BBP. And this is also one of our recommendations that such plastic rate schemes should be co-created with the service providers and the informal sector stakeholders, since most of standard setters and trading platforms are coming from the global north. We think it's really important to include those also in the design, and that's why we also asked them what would be important and helpful to them, and then we adjusted to their needs. And then another learning that it is difficult to communicate that it is not the data acquisition itself that we are, or that is being paid for, but the waste management service that they are providing. And this was new to them. This was one of their key lessons that they shared to us, and also which I found very heartwarming, that they said they're realizing that they are doing good to the environment with the work that they're doing, because often their work is not being respected in society, or rather being looked down upon, being a waste picker. And they felt very grateful and saying that this was the first time in their life that someone is recognizing the work that they're doing. And this was, very beneficial and appreciating also for us to hear. And that kind of encourages us, to continue working on ensuring that the voices and the needs of these workers are being heard, and that they are the ones that need to be included in the schemes, and that major financial benefits need to go to them. And so that's basically it. That was our key lessons learned and results presentation from ValuCred. I would like to take the opportunity to say, in the name of the entire consortium, a big thank you to the Prevent and GIZ team for your support, and also for your trust in letting us develop this program. And we hope that we can achieve many other things together. So thank you very much. And with that, I think, I hand back to Alessa.
Thank you, Christina. And our next presenter will be the Plastic Credit team in Brazil and Mexico, Maria, myself, and Ina. Maria from BVRio, myself from Zarape Circular, but we collaborated with Entreamigos, and Ina from Cirplus. So I'll hand it back to you, Maria.
Okay, so hi everyone, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. So I'm Maria Accioly, and I'll start presenting this other sub-pilot group, which was about developing and implementing a specific plastic credit standard in Brazil and Mexico. And it involved 3 institutions, as Alessa already said. I'm from ValuCred, and our role was to develop the Circular Action Hub, the Circular Credits mechanism, and implementing it in Brazil and Mexico, but Entreamigos will describe better Mexico later. So BVRio is a Brazilian NGO with offices also in the UK and other people in the Netherlands and other countries too. And we work with various areas, the waste circular economy is one of them. So just a brief historic, BVRio comes from a larger experience with carbon market. One of the founders participated in the first big carbon project in Malaysia, which led to the IPCC report, which led to a Nobel Prize. And this is not to compare the carbon credits, it's just a historic. So in 2013, BVRio created the first waste credit system in the world. It was called the Reverse Logistics Credit in Brazil. So in this pilot, we developed the Circular Action Hub, which is a global online platform aiming to connect waste recovery projects to potential supporters. And these projects could be of many types. It is a really open platform. The organizations could be since waste pickers organizations to small and medium enterprises. Also, the forms of support were more than one. We have the credit purchase itself, the performance-based payments, but only a more direct support like grants or sponsorships, and also prepayments for credits, which involves then a commitment to the future delivery of credits. Generally, it is a upfront payment for an investment in infrastructure. And also impact investment for the SMEs, for example. The circular credits mechanism is then the evolution of the reverse logistics credits, and it is a tool for the payments for ecosystem services. So it creates a second stream, an additional stream of revenue for the waste recovery and recycling projects, which commonly are not paid or underpaid for the services, only for the physical material. So the Circular Action Hub has a simple set of 9 principles, and the CCM a set of 7 principles, but they are quite overlapping, and they include environmental aspects and also social aspects. And these last learning by doing principle, which is to establish, to get clear that we cannot enforce a single model to every context. So since 2020, we developed some guidance documents. We established a technical advisory committee with these institutional participants. And from the discussions, we published some guidance notes, for example, about no double counting and no free riding, and also about additionality. Our process involves a third-party verification, requires a third-party verification. So we developed an audit protocol based on the CCM principles and with an associated checklist for the auditors. So we started the partnership with one international certifier, which is SGS. And so they audited our project in Brazil and Mexico. For monitoring and reporting, we developed some tools. Since an Excel sheet, for example, for control the inputs and outputs of materials. Also a monitoring report template to the projects. And then later, the Collect app, which is a cell phone app. It's a free app, and it's an app to track the transactions of materials. I will talk a little bit more further. So once a project is audited and approved, we can then issue the credits in the Hub's registry, which is public and use a blockchain, of course. So there we upload all the evidence that the transactions occurred, that the activities occurred. And then we can issue a circular impact statement based on the audit statement from SGS or from another certifier. So this was the process. Now talking a little bit about the Brazilian pilot itself. The context is that we have a national policy on solid waste from 2010. And this law defined, it is an EPR-ish law, but it is far to be complete. So it defined the shared responsibility for the reverse logistics of the products and packages, but the financial responsibilities of the waste generators is kind of weakly defined. So sometimes one is pushing to another, the responsibility. Also, the policy defines the integration of waste pickers in the process of reverse logistics, but there are some legal and financial difficulties associated to that. It's not working very well so far. Also, the policy is national, but the regulation is made by the states, and the states are in very different stages. Many of them still don't have their own regulations. Additionally, the responsibility for the solid waste management in Brazil is from the municipalities. And the municipalities very often, mostly actually, lack resources to perform an adequate selective collection, for example. On the other hand, Brazil has over 1 million waste pickers already performing collection and sorting activities. And they are quite organized. We have around 2,000 cooperatives, or probably more today, but they work in very precarious situation because the market value of the physical material is very low. It doesn't really cover all the operational costs. So the service, the environmental service they provide is still unpaid or underpaid in Brazil. So since BVRio launched the reverse logistics credits in 2013, a whole market developed in Brazil so that credits, or we can call them certificates too, are widely accepted in the country. They are officially accepted by the governments, and they are based on electronic document system, which is quite reliable. But the thing is, the values practiced are very low. There are some estimates according to which the values paid are like 5 to 10 times lower than they should be to actually cover the operational costs of these cooperatives. And there is no regulation about the prices. So this is a huge challenge in Brazil. Then in 2020, when BVRio launched the circular credits with a more global perspective, in the Prevent project, we worked with some waste pickers organizations in Brazil and with a network of collectors in Mexico. These are the participants cooperative. They were 5 in Rio de Janeiro state, 2 in São Paulo state. The photos are duplicated, 2 for each. And 3 for Minas Gerais state. Actually, they were a network in this case. So our main achievements in this pilot, some numbers. We have now 115 projects registered in the Hub's
Maria,
directory.
sorry for interrupting,
yeah.
but please keep track of the time, okay?
Yes.
A couple of more minutes. Thank you.
Okay, yeah. So over 40 countries in the Hub's directory, around 2,000 and almost 800 credits were issued so far for 13 projects. We developed this monitoring and reporting protocol for CCM, including the Collect app, also the audit protocol for CCM, with one international certifier able to perform the third-party audits. We had, in the end, 10 organizations from 3 states benefited in Brazil, including around 250 waste speakers, and 1,700 circular credits were issued in total for Brazil and Mexico. This was considering all kinds of plastics. In Brazil, we were able to pay for the credits, to pay above the market. So the credits were paid from 30% to 10 times over the local market in some cases. And these resources received by the cooperatives were used for direct remuneration, but also for buying equipment, rent, accounting or legal services and savings. And in the end, we published a guideline on best practices to help improve market prices. Okay, so we selected 3 key lessons learned, although we had more, of course. So the first one is about the Circular Action Hub, because originally the idea was that it functioned as a marketplace, which means stimulating the direct payment for the credits in the hub. But with this market still immature, it was not the case so far. However, the hub has become frequently used project directory for the industry. We have been searched for companies to start projects with them because of the visibility of the hub. The second lesson was that we realized that we really needed better monitoring and payment system, because each project has their own system, but they are usually not robust enough to audit. So in this line, we created and started testing and developed the Collect app, which is to track the transactions. So it allows to register the transactions in real time. It includes the informal autonomous waste pickers, even if they don't have a smartphone, and even if there's no internet in the moment. And the third lesson is about this necessity of involving the companies, the FMCGs, for have continuity and scale, because waste collection, sorting and recycling cannot depend only in grants in municipal collection or in the material market value, right? The environmental service needs to be consistently paid by the FMCG companies mainly, which, although curious about credits, they are still hesitant. So we have developed an alternative service, which is a more customizable packaging, which we call it Circular Action Program, which is more on the ground, because the company knows exactly which project it is supporting and how. And it usually involves the whole chain, and the result is certified tons collected, which can be offered as circular credits, but not necessarily. It can be only certified tons. So to conclude, I just wanted to highlight that this market for waste credits depends highly on the local context, of course, if we have APR systems in place. So if it's a matter of compliance or voluntary schemes. And in underdeveloped or developing countries, we generally don't have proper or full EPR systems. This is very important to notice. So in this context, waste credits can be tools to complement or to help build EPR. But the reality in these countries is that the waste recovery happens in a great part due to poverty, due to these, and we have mostly unpaid or underpaid collection sorting work still. So this brings us an imperative of social inclusion, so that we, with the CCM, we really pursue not only environmental, but also consistent social benefits to guarantee that the work is adequately paid. So we search for this balance between the strictness of a credit system and the social inclusion necessity to reach an adequate robustness. And lastly, this is very important. We would like to highlight that to increase volumes of collection and sorting and recycling, it is needed much more than punctual credits purchase. It is really needed a massive investment in infrastructure. So a long-term commitment from company side. So that's it. This is my contact, and Thierry's contact, our director of the Circular Action Hub and founder of the Circular Action Company, which is our partner. And I will handle to Entreamigos. Alessa.
Thank you, Maria, so much for the introduction. And well, I am going to present the pilot project developed in Mexico by Entreamigos. We implemented a circular credit system in a local waste collection value chain. Next, please. Maria, please. Next, thank you. So for this occasion, I am from Sarape Circular. And for this occasion, we work with a local community center called Entreamigos, and I believe every community providing and developing projects of plastic credits will be really good to have an ally like Entreamigos, because Entreamigos reflect everything that is good in a community. In Entreamigos, we work to foster intellectual, creative, and reflective capacities and to develop environmental and cultural consciousness. Inside the center, the whole center is built up with the upcycle principle. They use everything that was there to build it. And for example, the floor is made out of the glass that they found, and this tree over there is part of the entrance of the center. And well, they work with community education programs, and they have a Recicla shop, which promotes upcycling activities as an economic development for women. And they also have a sorting center, among a lot of other stuff. Next. So for this pilot project in Mexico, we developed a program called Bahía Circular, which is performance-based payments for inclusive recycling. And like everybody has mentioned previously, most of the sector is informal in countries like Mexico and Central America, at least. A big amount of the collectors, the segregators are participating in informal practices, but we believe it's a systematic consequence of social vulnerability. So we need to have inclusive processes to include them. And basically what we did was to operate a network of collectors in a coastal, systematically underfunded, low-income communities. We implement the circular credit mechanism, which Maria already explained to you, and we facilitated and support inclusive plastic collection systems. We operated also under the principles and criteria developed by BVRio and the Circular Action Program. And we tried to enhance a robust but inclusive monitoring and assessment system to ensure transparency and traceability by independent verification. So basically, we operated in the field everything that Maria just mentioned. Oh, Maria, can you go next? And what about the local context? We implemented, Entreamigos is located in San Pancho, Nayarit, which is a local touristic town. Inside Bahía de Banderas, we operated in 17 locations. And we choose this place because Nayarit is right now in the top 3 in highest rates of touristic development and ocean waste pollution in Mexico. It also holds a very, very important biological corridor called Sierra de Vallejo, which protects the jaguar and a lot of other species. And most of the activities, the collecting activities, are part of the informal sector, as I mentioned before. And also we found a lot of social vulnerabilities, like gentrification due to touristic development. So people working in the sorting centers cannot afford to live in the towns anymore because of the touristic development. And so that represents a big challenge for sorting centers to find people to work as recyclers and sorters in their centers. There's also different scopes of poverty. We found corruption. We faced corruption and organized crime while implemented the project. Next, please. But our first step to start implementing was to develop a social immersion. It was part of our solution to really understand the context, because we know that the social focus is essential for the for the permanency of the projects, but also for the communities to really understand what they are being part of. And I felt really identify what Christina said before, that they didn't really understand that the service, the environmental service that they were providing, needed to be paid as well, because I think it's a behavior and a perception that they have of themselves. So our first approach for the program was to develop cooperatives like they were doing in Brazil to follow their model. However, once we did the social immersion, we realized that the community and the sorting centers and the actors already, the stakeholders already involved in the value chain, were not interested in creating cooperatives. So we decided to work with the already existing network of collectors that even though they were not collaborating together, they knew they existed and it was already there. So yeah, we decided to just create the network and yeah, for them to get to know each other. And I think it was a great strategy. We implemented in semi-rural communities, which once we started the monitoring process, we realized that we have limited access to internet, so we couldn't, that represented a challenge for us to use a Collect app. And that's why we developed an hybrid inclusive monitoring system that I will talk to you later. As I mentioned, we observe negative social perceptions towards the stakeholders already working, because informality practices, like sometimes they won't show up or they will charge different prices because it's just not regulated. They have informality practices, and most of the time very unstable, unpaid, literally not paid work, and they only earn by the material that they sell. And so even though all of this, we realized that there was also a lot of, there was an extensive effort of packaging waste management, a lot of initiatives from civil society, a lot of voluntary efforts from the community to keep their ecosystems clean. However, we also find that there were non-sufficient technical skills or capacities developed within the network. Can you go next? And when I mean technical skills, we refer to basic monitoring of material, use of Excel, or organization for quality control. After we proposed the program, we registered in the Circular Action Hub, which helped us with the visualization of the projects, but also made us realize that we have to put a price for the credits, and that's where the challenge started. Next, Maria, please. And so, as I mentioned before, since we couldn't use the app, we developed an hybrid monitoring and reporting system, which is what Maria meant, because in every context, the particularities are very unique. And so what we did, we created an hybrid paper and digital database that followed the principles and criteria of the Circular Action Program and the Circular Action Hub. And the CCM, which are overlapping the principles and criteria. And we also learned a lot by doing. I think that was the most important part because all of the findings and informations we could gather while implementing the project, to avoid practices of double counting, and to understand the baseline for additionality, because since we were working with a network already created, already operating, we were just starting to monitor. That was also a challenge to understand the baseline for additionality. Next, please. Afterwards, we had we have two deliveries of credits, and we divided into 3 phases. Our delivery system was divided in 3 phases because, as I mentioned before, the context was very unique, and the monitoring and the robustness of the evidence collected was a challenge. And so we divided into 3 phases, and we monitor every step that the participants and the stakeholders were taking in this learning curve of monitoring their own inputs and outputs. And we establish the price of the credit depending on the level of robustness during the monitoring and the use of a digital monitoring tool. So the use of the digital monitoring tool was on the 3rd phase, therefore the price of the credit was higher. Also, one of our commitments was not only to deliver material incentives, but also personal protective equipment. And we realized that according to the local context, and some of the participants and the stakeholders of our value chain didn't have cards, like bank cards. They would only work on cash. The delivery system was a challenge as well, but we would recommend to use digital wallets as a delivery system. Next, please. And as Maria mentioned, we were also part of the independent verification. We were audited by SGS, and some of the areas opportunities that we've been noticing already, but were clear with the audit, was that every stakeholder needs to improve the documental control. How much are they collecting, and to keep track of this. Also, we try to incentivize them for formalization. However, there was a lot of fear, a lot of insecurities, and not a lot of interest, considering the basic legal requirements for local organizations. And well, we need to improve, and we need to incentivize the stakeholders to improve their mitigation measures regarding the quality that they are providing. As I mentioned before, a lot of the stakeholders had informal practices, which created like bad habits for their operations. And also they were not aware of the importance that they had, the role that they had in the whole chain, in keeping in reducing the environmental impact of their operations, and also to be aware of the risk in their operations for their people that work with them. Next, please. So our main achievements is that we did it while we were learning, which was really exciting, and we felt really proud of the effort. We established a network of collectors. 85 collectors were registered. However, and 82 of them were independent or street collectors, and we work with 3 organizations. We developed 145.83 credits, and every credit is a ton, to 62 collectors. At the end, 169 were approved, but to deliver the credits was also a challenge. We had 2 sessions with technical expertise with the organizations. We delivered the PPE, and we developed the CCM monitoring and reporting, the operation and independent verification, and we developed a guideline of best practices for collecting and sorting centers, to incentivize formalizing operations and improve operations. Because, as I mentioned, even though they were not interested, like the stakeholders were not interested in formalizing and avoid free riding, we told them that it's a process. That was our suggestions to them, is just step by step. And we in this guideline, we developed a step-by-step process for them to not overwhelm and be able to formalize activities and operations. 77 waste speakers benefited, including the organizations, which have their teams involved as well. And we collected 169,535 tons of plastic. Thank you. Next. Next, please. So our key lessons learned was that we need to build capacities and technical skills for local partners, because it's essential to be accountable for the deliverables of measuring, monitoring, and reporting phase. As I mentioned before, I believe, and this is my personal thought, that there is a lot of efforts from NGOs and the civil society, the third sector. However, they are not organized. And they don't have sufficient technical skills. So yeah, we will focus on developing a training program, a more robust training program, also considering the social process for accepting the environmental service that they are creating. Next, please. And also is that we realize that the technologies and the digital tools were essential as well to ensure transparency and data quality, because we cannot, because the sector is informal, there were a lot of practices that probably wouldn't be as easy to do if we were using the whole time a digital tool. Yes. Next, please.
Non, mais c'est bon maintenant. Non, tu peux y aller, maman, c'est bon. Ça arrive.
Someone got their microphone open. And our last key lesson learned was that to be able to implement plastic credit or circular credits mechanism as an ERP system tool that follows international standards under clear and standardized protocols, we need to have the flexibility also to adapt for inclusivity, but at the same time to be rigid or traceable enough to be market for the private sector. And we realized this because in the carbon market, you previously said it's a completely different story, but also follows the principle of the social permanency. So I believe, since this is the impact of the plastic credits, it's very local, there needs to be a social approach and to consider this as part of the protocols to tropicalize actions. Next, please. And well, final consideration is that actually, as a result of this pilot project, we created Zarape Circular, which is literally a business unit focusing on circularity, but with a social focus. And yes, I think we believe that to consider this mechanism as a market compensation solution to incentivize EPR systems in emerging markets like Mexico and Central America and Latin America, there needs to be an agreement to ensure long-term investment, because we can have the organization, solid organizational system to implement, because that's what we are going to do, building capacities. However, the investment is needed in the long term. And also super important is to consider CapEx for local recycling solution infrastructure. There's a lot of need for infrastructure. And that will be it. Thank you so much for your time. And I will then be handle it over to Ina from Cirplus.
Thank you very much, Alessa. Can you hear me? Just checking.
Yes.
Perfect. Apologies, there seems to be a technical issue with my camera, so I need to leave it switched off. But yeah, so as you saw, we've now kind of reached the third and last part of the Mexico Brasil pilot project sub-project presentation. And this part is really all about the actual sale of the collected plastic waste to get it back into new products and leverage market demand to incentivize on the ground collection and giving waste a value. So before I dive right in, I just wanted to give you a little bit of context and introduce Cirplus and why we need a digital solution like it. If you just switch to the next slide, please, Maria. Next two, yeah, no, another one, please. So just a bit of background context. So at the moment, we still live in a world where virgin plastic is cheaper than recycled plastics. What this means is that plastic processors have no economic incentive to include recycled plastics in their products, simply because it's more expensive. Next slide, please. What we see, though, is that this is changing very fast. We've got new regulations coming, like plastic taxes, and companies are pledging to include more recycled plastics in their products. Next slide, please. But while we see all these pledges and regulations coming up, and that this is good in practice, it's just still very hard for any plastic processor or big brand to procure recycled plastics. Why is that? We think it's mainly because of three main reasons. Because the market is extremely fragmented. So we have thousands of waste owners and recyclers, which makes it very much impossible for any human brain to aggregate and know which recycled plastics are available where and when and at what quality. So that's why it's then makes it really hard to secure consistent quality and quantity as an input or feedstock for new products. And then also we lack digital readiness. So this means that the sale and procurement processes are still mostly conducted offline with phones and fax machines, which makes it very inefficient. And yeah, it's just very hard to create a market that works for recycled plastics. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is basically where Cirplus comes in. So Cirplus is a digital sales and procurement platform for recycled plastics. And our goal is really to make the procurement processes simpler, cost efficient, and transparent. So essentially, we want to commodify recycled plastics via digitization and thereby enable recycled plastics to make their way back into new products at scale. Next slide, please. And this is just to add to some understanding. So basically, Cirplus is a three-sided marketplace with waste owners, recyclers, and plastic processors or brands here, where waste owners can offer their plastic waste feedstock for sale, which recyclers can then buy and turn into plastic recyclates. And these recycled plastics are then sold to plastic processors or brands who use it to make new products. So that's just a little bit of context. Next slide, please. So now let's look at the Mexico pilot project itself. Our main objective at Cirplus was to connect the Bahia de Banderas informal waste recovery sector with the global market by offering the plastic waste collected through Entreamigos, so what Alessa just explained to you before, on the Cirplus marketplace. And the plan was to onboard local waste owners or recyclers support the digitization process and enable material standards to ensure the competitiveness of this locally recovered material on the global market. Next slide, please. So we've got 3 main achievements within the project. The first one is that we successfully localized the surplus marketplace for the Mexican market. We've heard this many times now throughout this presentation. Localization is just really key. So what we did is we translated and made the whole surplus website and platform available in Spanish, which basically this makes this platform accessible to any Spanish-speaking individual with internet access. Next slide, please. The second achievement was our local user acquisition. So we onboarded new users on the surplus marketplace that are already offering 6,000 tons of recycled plastics a year on surplus for sale. These users are indirectly linked to the Bahia Circular collection ecosystem, though, meaning that at the moment they do not directly receive collected waste from Entreamigos, but are within the geographical area where the project was developed and can therefore be integrated in the future. I will talk more about this in the lessons learned. And next, please. And then our last main achievement was the establishment of local standards in form of DIN Spec 91446, which, in case you don't know what this is actually the first international standard for high quality recycled plastics that Surplus initiated last year together with the German Institute for Norms. And I just want to give a little bit more detail to explain what it is. So just the next slide, please. Yeah, so the DIN Spec, the main goal of the DIN Spec is really to facilitate the procurement process of recycled plastics by bringing transparency about the materials being traded. So the DIN Spec itself defines a system for the classification of recycled plastics based on the data available for the material. And then it provides guidelines for labeling of the recycled type and content and gives guidance for the characterization of plastic waste as a feedstock for recycling. So on the right here, you see, for example, what a labeling of a big bag could look like. At the heart of the standard are so-called DQLs, which stands for data quality levels, which are labels that classify recycled plastics based on the available data known about the material, where the principle is the more information is provided, the higher the DQL. So as part of the project, if we can just go to the next slide, please. We created a Spanish user guide and provided this guide to our New Mexican users so that the material, so that they could understand what the standard was about, and that their material offered on Surplus was then qualified according to the data quality levels, or DQLs, which then means that any global buyer can now easily understand, okay, which quality does this material actually have? Next slide, please. So I also want to share some key lessons learned. First of all, we learned that we need higher minimum collection volumes, to build a direct link between the informal collection system and a credible waste management or recycling partner. So before I mentioned that we onboarded new users on Surplus that were only indirectly linked to the collection value chain. This is because at the moment, collection volumes were still relatively low, meaning that the material goes through several informal waste traders before it reaches a more formal recycler. But on surplus, we only onboarded more formal waste owners or recyclers because as a B2B digital marketplace, user credibility is really key. And this is where it becomes really tricky when we talk about really informal stakeholders. So what this means and what we learned is if we want to create this direct link, we really need higher minimum collection volume. So at least about a truckload of, like, let's say 25 tons, so that it becomes viable for the more formal recycler to directly trade with a more informal waste collection community. The second lesson learned refers to the cooperation with local stakeholders, which is really crucial. So we really need to collaborate with local recyclers because this is the only way we can guarantee the uptake of the plastic waste from collection partners and then achieve this integration between formal and informal markets. And third, we learned that the standardization initiatives can really be leveraged to successfully match suppliers of plastic waste or recyclates with the global demand. So we've demonstrated this with the DIN Spec 91446, but this will become even more relevant with more internationally known standards. So for example, we are already working on transferring the DIN Spec into a European standard by next year. So standardization is really powerful because it creates this transparency on data quality and fosters the credibility and trust between buyers and sellers. So this is all from my side. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me, and then I'll hand you over to Alessa and the India team for some more very exciting insights.
Thank you, Ina. We are a little bit tight on time, and so I will pass it over to the India team presenting the Repurpose project, establishment of a scientific framework and benchmarks for EIA of Plastic Credits projects in India, and presenting the additionality of plastic credits to low-value plastics.
Great, thanks, Alessa. So we'll be having two parts to this presentation. I'm Svetlana, and I'm from the Repurpose Global team. Alessa, could we go to the next slide, please? All right. Not sure if this is the updated presentation, but all right. We could just go step back a little bit. All right, so this project, good evening to one and all present here. This project was essentially between Wuppertal Institute and Repurpose Global in collaboration with our impact partners on the ground in India. And how this project was really divided is Wuppertal Institute, owing to their strong research focus, looked strongly into the environmental impact assessment, baseline assessments of the project, and Repurpose focused in on activating the impact on the ground through our network of partners in Kerala, Goa, and Maharashtra and India. We can go next. Alessa? All right, so in India, there's about 62 million tons of waste that is generated every single year, and over 3.5 million tons is just plastic waste. But when we talk about plastics, as we all aware, there are high-value plastics and low-value plastics. And so in India, for materials like PET, the collection and recycling rates are well over 80%. And so the informal sector really has been historically focusing on cherry picking the high-value materials. And so what really gets left behind, as would be the case in most other countries as well, most other low and middle income countries, is that the flexible plastics comprising of, say, candy wrappers or your chips packets or really low value, flimsy plastic bags tends to get neglected from all sort of informal chains of collection. And just due to the sheer volumes of this kind of waste and very poor infrastructure for waste management in India, often this waste is burnt, as you can see in the pictures here, set on fire, very common practice in India, or sent to landfills or dump sites. And if you're near the coast, a lot of households have a practice of dumping it into the nearest water body, and it eventually ends up into the ocean. So this is, of course, in places where waste management infrastructure is not very robust. And so when we looked at this project, we looked at financing the collection and ethical processing of these low value plastics, which clearly did not have any inherent economic or recycling value. And so we looked at plastic credits as a way to put funding into the value chain and incentivized waste workers and waste management organizations on this ground to collect and ethically process this waste. So that's just a little context on the baseline. For all our projects that we're going to speak about, we have focused on mostly multi-layered plastics and flexible plastics. So Wuppertal Institute also substantiated this baseline through their own baseline assessments, and Henning will take that up in the second half of this presentation. But we can go next, Alessa. Great. So how did we really approach plastic credits as a solution to trying to bridge the gap between these low-value plastics in the environment and channeling them to the right end destination? So if I may summarize it, there are 4 key parts to this project implementation. First was obviously assessing the baseline and understanding which materials we want to focus in on. In India right now, the MLP collection and recycling processing rate is just about 3.5%, which means that over 90% still ends up in some form in the environment. And so that really was established to the baseline. The second was really developing these plastic credit projects in collaboration with very experienced waste management partners and organizations on the ground. And so we selected 3 partners for this project who were tasked with recovering low-value plastics from the environment. The third stage is really activating this impact. When we say activating, it means everything right from setting up the project, mapping out the infrastructure, ensuring that the collections and waste inflow is actually moving through the value chain, and we're able to trace every piece of plastic that's coming in right from collections all the way to the end destination where it is finally processed. And of course, the fourth pillar is really conducting due diligence, assessing traceability on an ongoing basis to see how much of this plastic was actually collected and ethically processed. We can go next, Elisa. So these are the 3 project locations where we focused our efforts. All of them are in India. As you can see, Kerala and Goa are situated literally on the coastline, and so they are ocean bound, which means that in all likely cases, if such projects were not implemented, this would end up in some form into the oceans. All of the project sites in these 2 locations are located within 50 kilometers of the coastline. And then we have another project in Maharashtra, which is also the highest contributor of plastic waste to India's stats. Almost 400,000 tons is contributed from Maharashtra alone. And this project, if such implementations were not supported, it would most likely end up in terrestrial nature ecosystems or landfills and illegal dump yards. As you can also see, Goa is a very Goa and Kerala extremely famous tourist spots, and with high tourist footfalls every year, these areas have been plagued with plastic waste, and especially low-value plastics. So you'll see in certain villages where low-value plastics aren't managed, people literally burn this waste every single evening, and that's extremely detrimental to the environment, as you all might understand. We can go next. So if we had to summarize what all was entailed in the project setup roadmap, everything from, of course, baseline assessments. The next crucial step is really understanding what waste management infrastructure really works in the different geographies, right? So what would be the collection infrastructure, what would be the sorting infrastructure, and what would be the infrastructure to kind of send it to the end destination, and who's going to finally process this material. Because as per our plastic credit protocol, we do not stop at just collection. We want to ensure that the collected material goes to the best possible environmental destination that's available in that location. And so that's a crucial part, the mapping of the waste management infrastructure. And of course, then obtaining permissions. All of these three projects are multi-stakeholder projects involving the local authorities, involving end destinations, and so really ensuring that we have permissions in place, contracts in place, environmental safeguards in place is something that's very key to our projects. The next is stakeholder engagement. So working with the local authorities to kind of set a vision of what we want to do with such projects, building awareness on why this is so important, and also sort of generating their buy-in and support for such projects. Then we move to onboarding waste workers. So all three projects provide livelihood opportunities to waste workers. And in different capacities. So in Kerala, we work on a self-help group model where waste workers have formed a self-help group, and we've leveraged them for waste collections. In Maharashtra, we've worked with informal waste pickers who were previously picking from the streets or from landfills, and sort of brought them to a central place where we've got permissions to collect waste from the municipalities, and then give them a good place to sit and sort the waste, where the waste comes to them instead of them going and picking waste in the landfill. So different kinds of models depending on the geographic nuances, but the crux is onboarding and engaging waste pickers and waste workers through these projects. We also focused in on provision of PPE and safety equipment for all workers, really conducting the on-ground waste management, and then traceability and reporting. We can go next, Alessa. Alessa? Great, thank you. So the solution slightly varies across all the three project locations, but if we had to summarize, some of the key highlights were really or commonalities rather, was using plastic credits as a way to set up a low value plastic waste value chain, right? And also setting up traceability mechanisms to ensure that the partners or the on-ground implementation partners are working and reporting within these frameworks. Second, like I said, is leveraging public-private partnerships and also leveraging their infrastructure wherever possible. So we're not really reinventing the wheel, but also leveraging the power of collaboration to make these systems work. I've already covered engaging self-help groups and workers and supporting infrastructure development at the village level. So if the village level collectors needed, say, raincoats for the monsoons in India, raincoats were provided to them. And so similar interventions were conducted. Awareness campaigns, we also had World Environment Day, which came in June, and so a lot of cleanup drives, a lot of community awareness sessions were also undertaken to increase waste segregation at source. And for making it easier to manage this waste once it comes to the aggregation and collection facilities. And lastly was ensuring that every single piece of plastic from these projects was either sent to a recycling facility if there was any recycling value. So if it was not metallized MLP, for example, and if the infrastructure allowed in that region, we did send low value recyclables for recycling. But for the most part, because we focused in on MLP, it was sent to cement kilns for co-processing for use as an alternative fuel for energy recovery. We can go next. So this is just a generalized value chain approach that we followed across all projects. So in all three value chains, it was mostly working with the formal sector. When we say formal sector, we mean collecting waste from households, commercial establishments, cleanup drives, street sweeping, etc. So these were the sources from where plastics were collected. It was collected either by our partners' own staff in certain cases where they have onboarded waste pickers and leveraged them or upskilled them for collection, or we've engaged with self-help groups or with the local municipalities and sort of had partnerships with them to assist with the collection arm of things. Then when it comes to our facilities, either our collection or recovery facilities, there is sorting that happens. And so all of the low value plastics are separated out. The high values are anyway sold and into the recycling markets, but the low values are collected, data is recorded, and then the recycling fraction, like I said, is sent for recycling, and the co-processing, the multi-layered plastics are sent to cement kilns for co-processing, as that is the most recommended end destination, given the complexity of the material and given the lack of recycling infrastructure for recycling such hard to recycle materials. We can go next, Alessa. Yeah, I think we've covered most of this. So the key things that we focused in are end-of-life management of low-value plastics, creating stable workplaces for the waste workers, and setting up robust traceability systems so all of this could be tracked. Next, Alessa. So in terms of standards, we follow something called the Plastic Credit Protocol and Impact Code, which really governs how serve as guidance documents for us on how we should run these projects, how plastic credits should be leveraged, and what are the socio-economic standards we need to sort of adhere to when we're running our projects to ensure things like no child labor, no forced labor, workers have good working conditions to implement their activities, and so on and so forth. Alessa, we can go next. Is there a way to request control? Maybe that would be easier. So if you had to read through the Plastic Credit Protocol, really, these are the principles we base the projects on. Establishing additionality, traceability, ensuring, I think like most of the other presentations, ensuring uniqueness. So having measures in place to ensure double counting of plastic waste doesn't happen. Verifiability, so each piece of plastic waste has a full chain of custody documentation that backs it. And of course, ensuring socioeconomic safeguards and environmental safeguards. When we say things like environmental safeguards, we mean having the right consent to operate, having the pollution control board certificates for these end destinations to ensure that the net environmental benefits are not really outweighing, are outweighing the cons of setting up the project. We can go next, Alessa. Can I cost for control? Yeah, these are just some initiatives and snapshots of some of the socioeconomic interventions as well. Like I said, workers were given raincoats for the monsoons, cleanup drives for World Environment Day. All workers were given uniforms, PPE equipment to enable better workplace conditions. We can go next, Alessa. I think that should be the last. So the project across all 3 locations is targeted to recover 1 million kgs of low-value plastics. We've already recovered 660,000 tons, 660,000 kgs of plastics, and by the end of the project in September, we are on track to recover another 300,000 kilograms. Most of this is already recovered. It's just under the verification stage where we are ensuring the traceability and reporting protocols are being followed. So yeah, I think over to Henning now from the Wuppertal research team, who will be talking more about how they conducted the environmental impact assessment related to these projects.
Thanks a lot, Svetlana. And also thanks a lot for giving us the opportunity to give a first overview on the impact assessment. As Svetlana mentioned, the idea was to develop a holistic view on plastic credits and the specific activities that were initiated by this project. So what we did was to start to define the different concrete project activities and also to highlight how they build up on the baseline assessment that Svetlana mentioned. We then try to understand and structure the specific environmental components that are in different ways affected by the activities, and then to match the specific environmental impacts to the different steps of the project. What you see here is that we try to differentiate between direct environmental components, so the change of CO2 emissions through the setup of the waste management value chain in comparison to the previous status that, as Svetlana mentioned, was basically landfilling. the saving of raw materials through the co-processing and the recycling of the plastic waste, because the material would otherwise have been burned or leaked into the environment. And by that, the materials would have been lost and new plastic would have to be produced. Then we also included employment effects for workers engaged in the collection of the waste, segregating and pre-processing the waste, as well as in the step of the transport of the sorted plastic waste to the cement kilns or the recycling facilities. We try to build up on that by looking also at indirect environmental and social components, mainly based on a literature review on the different safeguard documents that Svetlana presented. And what we tried to include here was effects on marine wildlife. So if animals actually die from contact with plastic waste, for example, by swallowing it, we looked at impacts on the terrestrial wildlife, mainly through the open dumping and the burning of the plastic waste. We looked at the health of humans, for example, by impacts on the household incomes by plastic littering and the following pollution, specifically in the fishing industry and the tourism industry. That is the matrix that you see here, where we try to structure where are the different impacts relevant, what do we have to take into account while looking at complex activities like the pilot projects that are currently conducted. On the next slide, you see some of our first results. What we see is that the quantification of CO2 savings that we're currently working on as a standalone indicator is clearly not sufficient to present the overall positive environmental impacts that came along with the implementation of waste management systems, or here sorting, collection, and recycling activities. From a CO2 perspective, we see that, of course, the recycling of plastic waste would be the preferred option, but also CO2 savings can be achieved when the recycled material is used to substitute other plastic materials. So it makes sense to have the specific emphasis on CO2 emissions, and this is, of course, something that a lot of activities are measured by. What we see is that the real life scenarios and the comparison between the baseline and the first impact assessment evaluations, they show that particularly in the rural regions of India, this is much more complex. The infrastructure is really challenging, and the high amounts of low value plastic, and here specifically the multi-layer plastics, they are definitely non-recyclable at the current state of infrastructure and technology. So what we want to do in the final assessment report is not only to focus on potential CO2 savings, but also to include environmental and social impacts that came along with the implementation of the waste management system in these three regions. Against that background, on the next slides, some of our key lessons learned. We've seen it makes a lot of sense to focus on valorizing especially the lowest plastic value polymers through plastic credits. So those waste streams and parts of the household waste where the incentives is definitely, where the economic incentives definitely not enough to set up a collection and recycling system. So what we have here in our focus is the improvement of a collection and recycling rate of plastic that has this specific low value. And here we talk mainly about the multi-layer plastics. I mentioned it before, our second key learning, environmental assessment of plastic credits should not be limited to CO2 emissions, but also consider other indicators and definitely also social aspects. CO2 emissions are, of course, important for investors, but they are clearly not a completely comprehensive metric for a holistic impact assessment. And that's why also other topics and issues like leakage into the environment, impact of microplastics must be considered. And interestingly, this also refers to the more methodological discussion on life cycle assessments, where we have exactly the same challenges, how to include, for example, marine littering in a holistic assessment of specific recycling technologies, for example. Third point, we see that public-private partnerships are beneficial for building up end-to-end waste management systems. What we also discussed in other task force of the Prevent Alliance is that strong partnerships between local governments on the one hand and the plastic credit providers can be beneficial to ensure holistic waste management systems. This is, of course, a specific challenge. There need to be very specific regulations, cooperation platforms in order to ensure that these synergies are actually generated, and there are a couple of risks to that. We see that in the specific regions where we conduct the pilot projects, we have stakeholders with very different interests. So yes, there is the possibility of really relevant synergies, but they have to be actively addressed, and they have to be made very explicit as part of the project. With that, thank you very much. We really look forward to your comments and questions.